Whether you love it or hate it, St. Patrick's Day is definitely a holiday that people can get behind. There's a lot of things that make it very interesting. And there's definitely some benefits, such as being able to drink, and there's like drink sales, and you can pinch people that you don't like, which is definitely something I can get behind. It's the lucky holiday, St. Patrick's Day. Hello and welcome to my corner of the internet. Today we are green. If you weren't aware, and I don't know how you possibly couldn't have been, because if you didn't wear green today, I hope people pinched you. I do. And I'm giving you a disapproving glare right now. But if you did wear green, then I wish you all the luck and a very fortunate future. Now, most people are very misconceptioned about the history of St. Patrick's Day. Maybe you felt a little bit curious and you decided to take a quick little Google search and you found the most vague part. There was some old guy with a long beard holding like a four-leaf clover, and his name was St. Patrick. Wow, awesome. Totally super cool. But he did a lot more. He went through a lot more than just being the guy that made St. Patrick's Day a thing. And I'm here to help share that with you. For starters, St. Patrick was a Christian missionary that worked with several other religious figures during the 5th century to convert the current inhabitants of Ireland to Christianity. And he was widely honored as the enlightener of England, and his eventual death was widely acknowledged by the Christian people. His dad was a minister for their tiny little town, and when he grew up, he took over what his dad did and did it for himself. And he was widely honored by the people, especially because of what he went through as like a late teenager, but we'll get to that in a bit. One of the biggest excuses people used his death for was the Lenten religion didn't really like people to have any sort of fun at all, which basically meant no dancing or booze or even really meat. They couldn't eat meat. So, as people do, they took his death and turned it into an excuse to do all of those things. And I would say modern society has outgrown that, but we clearly have not. The history of this strange old Christian guy with a strange attachment to four-leaf clovers is neither interesting nor really a secret. I found this stuff pretty quickly online, and anyone that had any sort of interest probably would have too. But I'm hoping that by me here telling it to you, you'll find it more interesting than if you just read an article about it on Wikipedia. But at the very least, look up some images of this St. Patrick's guy. He's pretty cool. And which brings us into the more interesting bit of this bit of history. For starters, the previous inhabitants of Ireland, the people before they were Christianized, were under a religion called paganism, which is pretty typical in being involved in worshiping gods through churches and other means, and there were sacrifices, which is not really uncommon. But what makes it uncommon is that they were burning people alive, which they did in the Salem witch trials. But here it's different because they would make these giant statues called the Wicker Men, and they would weave together sticks and use the wicker pattern, the same stuff they used to make wicker baskets, and then they'd put sacrifices in there. That could include animals and like food, and also criminals who were very much alive. Because if there's one thing criminals deserve, it's to be placed in a wicker statue, and then they would just set them on fire and just walk away, I guess. Interestingly enough, there's a 1973 British movie creatively titled The Wicker Man, that has to do with the subject of that kind of thing, if that sounds interesting to you. The most unfortunate part of this lucky holiday, St. Patrick's Day, is that people are so focused on the deliciously chemically modified green food dye and booze, they fail to do a little detective work and dig deeper into St. Patrick's life. And people seem content to just deal with and accept that St. Patrick's Day nowadays just comes down to green with 4-leaf clovers and booze and deliciously chemically modified green food dye that we know and love. But if you do a little detective work, just a quick search of the Google, you can find some pretty interesting stuff that even goes a little bit beyond the burning people alive in wicker statues, which is kind of hard to top, but they certainly try. At age 16, St. Patrick's Village, the little tiny town where he lived with his parents, his dad was a Christian minister, very well known in their little town, and widely honored, which is one reason that Patrick becomes also widely honored when he comes back. But his little town was ransacked by a group of soldiers from the Irish king. And at the time, the Irish had been going around and doing that to other villages, taking over, getting food, supplies, people. And so, unsurprisingly, St. Patrick was captured and taken as a slave. He was a shepherd. And this is really when his Christianity started to bloom, because while he was a slave, he thought to himself, man, my dad was right with his teachings and morals and all that stuff. So he really gets enlightened with Christianity, and it gets bad to the point where he's praying 100 times during the day and 100 times at night, which I guess you have to cope some way with being a slave, and I guess that's when we can do it. But he does that for a while, at least until he's 20. He was 16, so at least 5 or so years, a handful of years. And eventually he was on the coast and he stumbled upon this ship, a pirate ship. Well, basically as piratey as the town would have allowed. There was no aye mateys and eye patches or anything like that, but there was the Times equivalent. So he gets on the ship with them, and he teaches them the Christian ways. But they actually get very mad at him because they dock on the island, or they dock closer to Britain, and they're starving, and they just can't find food. And they're like, oh yeah, where's your Christianity now, sucker? And then they abandon him. So that's super cool. And he basically spends a lot of time just wandering the continent and eventually finds his way home, which is kind of unrealistic because I don't see how at the time, with no maps and no real compasses or way to guide yourself, he used the northern stars. The stars just told him where to go. But he eventually found his way back home and was greeted by the townspeople and his parents. And he began training of his own to become the minister one day. And the super renowned Christian, who then helped spread Christianity further with the other super renowned Christians of the time. And he was chosen because of his just popularity and his tragic childhood story of being captured and turned into a slave. All this to say, St. Patrick's Day is arguably a very interesting day, named after a very interesting dude, and you can't say that you don't appreciate this day, because if a guy can get captured by pirates and if he can end up on a ship of pirates after being captured and turned into a slave, where his only real companions were sheep for a long while, then I'm sure we can take a moment to appreciate and truly honor this holiday. and hear his story. But after a little bit of extra digging, I found some critics. So now we get to the interesting part. More interesting than wicker statues and pirates and all that. We have people arguing that everything was falsified. Nothing's real. Nothing's true. This holiday is just a scam created by the government for capitalism. So some people suspect that St. Patrick wasn't captured at all. He wrote a few works in his time about his experiences being captured. And basically they're like, yeah, that's not true. They're like, they find it doubtful that he crossed the countryside like half of Europe undetected just to try and get back home. Not only would he have had to, one, survive, two, he would have been able to magically find directions back to his hometown. Unless he's just like magical too. He has the power of the leprechauns on his side. And apparently he did that. And they suspect that he just left because he didn't want his dad's job. Because while he was a Christian minister, he was also like kind of like the tax guy. He collected the tax. He was death's. He was your wallet's like Grim Reaper, being like, yeah, you gotta pay your taxes. And the economy of the village was beginning to fail, sort of like an invisible crack in the infrastructure. And St. Patrick was like, yeah, I don't want to do that. So they suspect he just fled and then just completely made up this story about like getting captured and all that. But there's just such a big disconnect between how do you decide between, yeah, was this village ransacked and people were captured, or is it just false and made up because a guy didn't want to take over his dad's job? We can't say this about St. Patrick. He's very dramatic, for sure, because at the very least, we can probably say he dramatized things a little bit. But understandable, why would you not want to add just a little bit of extra detail to spice things up in your story? If you had to write an autobiography about yourself, I can almost guarantee there'd be parts where you would either stretch the truth or add in details that probably didn't be added in to put yourself in a better light or make your life seem more interesting than just get up, go to work, come home, eat dinner, and then like do whatever you want for the rest of the evening and then eventually collapse out of pure exhaustion that comes with the monotony of a normal day. Which, that's not exciting. No one's gonna read a 200-page book about that. But if you take your regular story and go, yeah, I did all this extra stuff. I like saved a kid from running into the street to get their toy, or something like, or I saved a cat from a tree. That sounds a little bit more interesting and more like I'd read that than just not saying that. And that's what St. Patrick did. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out in my little corner and listen to the history of this holiday. Next time, next year, maybe this year, it's kind of late already. But when you do St. Patrick-related things, like hang up a shamrock, or drink an Irish beer, or have a St. Patrick's Day cupcake, think about St. Patrick and everything he went through and his impact on Ireland. Thank you.